the joint briefing room aboard the Thessari command vessel, Sovereign's Reach, has the particular atmosphere of a space where one side considers itself fundamentally superior and sees no reason to disguise that assessment behind diplomatic courtesy. Captain Rylan Mercer has spent 2 years as human military attaché to the Thessari Seventh Fleet, and he has learned to recognize this atmosphere the way a sailor learns to recognize weather patterns. Not with alarm, but with the calm awareness of someone who understands exactly what's coming and has already decided how to respond to it. He sits at the human delegation's assigned position near the eastern wall, a small table slightly removed from the main briefing area, positioned in a way that communicates human participation without suggesting human equality. It's a seating arrangement that Rylan noticed during his first week of service and has never once seen altered. The Thessari don't assign human personnel to marginal positions out of malice. They simply don't consider any other arrangement. Approximately 30 Thessari military officers fill the central briefing area, occupying the seats and positions that command attention and shape discussion. The human contingent, Rylan, 2 junior attachés, and a technical specialist, occupies the periphery. It's a dynamic that has been consistent across every joint briefing Rylan has attended, and one he stopped being bothered by approximately 18 months ago. Being bothered by it accomplishes nothing. Understanding it accomplishes everything. The Thessari are an imposing species in any setting, but in military contexts, they carry themselves with the particular confidence of warriors who have been fighting wars for 8,000 years and have never seriously questioned whether their approach to warfare is the definitive standard. They have elongated ears that detect frequencies beyond human range and skin, that shifts through colors communicating rank, emotional state, and tactical assessment with precision that makes human body language look rudimentary. Tonight's briefing is about joint operational planning for an upcoming border patrol. Routine coordination between Thessari and human forces that requires acknowledging each other's capabilities and limitations. The Thessari portion of the briefing has been proceeding with the kind of self-assured efficiency that Rylan has learned to tune out over 2 years of similar sessions. Commander Thessara stands at the front of the briefing room delivering an assessment of human military capabilities. She's impressive by any measure, tall, commanding, with the bearing of someone who has led Thessari forces for decades and has never had reason to doubt the superiority of her experience or judgment. Her skin shows confident gold throughout her presentation, the specific shade that indicates someone who considers what they're saying to be obvious truth rather than debatable opinion. Human forces demonstrate adequate capability for escort duties and secondary patrol positions. Thessara says, her voice carrying the smooth, practiced authority of someone delivering an assessment she considers self-evident. Their weapon systems are functional if somewhat outdated by current Thessari standards. Their tactical doctrine shows occasional creativity that produces useful results, though it lacks the depth and refinement that 8 millennia of continuous military tradition provides. Several Thessari officers show entertained amusement, skin colors flickering through the particular shade of gold that accompanies observations they find both accurate and mildly amusing. The assessment is landing exactly as Thessara intends, reinforcing the shared understanding among Thessari officers that human forces are useful but fundamentally limited. The primary limitation of human military capability, Thessara continues, is experiential. Humans have been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. Their organized military tradition spans perhaps 500 years, a fraction of a single dynasty in Thessari history. They have not been tested the way Thessari forces have been tested. They have not endured what we have endured. They have not faced the kind of sustained, generational conflict that produces genuine depth of military experience. More nods, more entertained skin colors. The room is comfortable with this assessment because it aligns with assumptions that have been reinforced through years of working alongside human forces that are, by Thessari standards, inexperienced. We should not expect human units to perform at levels comparable to Thessari forces in high-stress combat situations. Thessara concludes, her voice carrying the finality of someone wrapping up an obvious point. They are fragile, they are inexperienced, they are fundamentally untested, Rylan says from his position at the human delegation's table. The word isn't loud, isn't aggressive or confrontational. It's delivered with the calm, level tone of someone repeating back exactly what was said, without emphasis, without emotion, without any inflection that suggests challenge or disagreement. Just the word itself, spoken clearly enough to be heard across the briefing room. Thessara's attention shifts to him. Her skin flickers through a brief flash of irritated surprise, the specific shade that indicates someone who wasn't expecting to be interrupted and finds the interruption mildly offensive coming from the direction it's coming from. "I'm sorry," she says, and the two words carry enough weight to communicate that she's not actually sorry and would prefer the interruption hadn't happened. "You said humans are untested," Rylan repeats, maintaining the same level, unhurried tone. "I wanted to make sure I heard that correctly before we moved on." "That is what I said," Thessara confirms, her skin settling back into confident gold. "Humans have not faced the kind of sustained conflict that produces genuine military depth. That's not meant as insult. It's an objective assessment based on. You're right that human military tradition is shorter than Thessari tradition," Rylan says, and there's something in his voice now. Not louder, not more forceful, just slightly different in a way that makes several officers in the room pay closer attention than they were a moment ago. "But I'd like to correct one specific claim before we continue with operational planning." He doesn't wait for permission or acknowledgement, doesn't ask whether it's appropriate to challenge the briefing's assessment. He simply reaches for his left sleeve with his right hand, and with a motion that's practiced enough to suggest he's done this before, deliberate, unhurried, completely without drama, rolls it back to the elbow. The sleeve falls away, and the briefing room goes silent. Rylan's forearm is covered in scars. Not a few dramatic wounds that might invite a single heroic narrative. Not the kind of injuries that prompt questions about specific battles or memorable moments of danger survived. The kind of scars that tell a story too long and too complex to be reduced to any single telling. Dozens of them. Layered across the skin with density that speaks of sustained, repeated contact with violence accumulated over years. Some are thin lines, surgical in their precision, the kind that result from blade weapons or focused energy discharge. Others are broader, rougher, irregular in shape. The marks of explosive damage, impact injuries, wounds sustained in conditions that didn't allow for clean or careful healing. Several sets of scars overlap, newer injuries laid directly over older ones, creating a topography of accumulated damage that communicates duration and repetition as clearly as any written record. They are old. That much is visible even to someone unfamiliar with human wound healing. The scars have the pale, slightly raised quality of injuries that healed years ago, some of them clearly decades ago. The oldest wounds have faded to the point where they're almost invisible unless the light catches them at a specific angle. The newest visible scars are still sharp enough to suggest they healed within the last 5 or 6 years. This is not recent damage. This is not a single conflict's record. This is an entire career written on skin. Commander Thessara has stopped mid-sentence. Her skin, which had been showing confident gold throughout her assessment, shifts in a single visible motion to something entirely different. A color that Rylan has seen enough times in 2 years of working with Thessari military personnel to recognize immediately and without ambiguity. Recognition, not surprise at an unexpected sight, not shock at something disturbing. Recognition, the specific response that occurs when a Thessari warrior sees something they understand the meaning of instinctively, something that communicates information as clearly as written text to someone who knows how to read it. Because in Thessari military culture, scars are not simply evidence of injury survived. They are a specific kind of record, a physical chronicle of conflict endured, duties fulfilled, battles fought, and survived without the luxury of choosing when or how. Thessari warriors carry their own scars with pride precisely because those scars communicate experience in ways that verbal accounts and written records cannot match. The density of scarring, the pattern of wound distribution, the visible age of different injuries, all of it readable to someone trained to interpret what they're seeing, communicating volumes of information in a single glance. And Commander Thessara, with decades of her own combat experience, knows exactly how to read what she's seeing on Rylan's arm. The briefing room is completely silent, not the polite, attentive silence of people listening to an important presentation. The absolute, profound silence of a room where something has just been displayed that has rendered the previous conversation entirely irrelevant. Thessari officers throughout the room are staring at Rylan's forearm. Their skin colors have shifted dramatically from the entertained gold they were showing moments ago, shocked white on some faces, deep analytical blue on others, contemplative purple on several officers who appear to be actively reading the scar patterns with the focused attention of someone examining a complex document. On at least 3 faces, Rylan can see something that looks uncomfortably like embarrassment. The specific shade of purple that indicates someone who has just realized their previous assumptions were wrong and is processing the implications of that realization. Rylan doesn't speak, doesn't explain or contextualize or draw attention to any specific scar or wound pattern, doesn't gesture toward his arm or invite examination or offer any narrative about what the injuries represent or how they were sustained. He simply holds his arm where it can be seen clearly, maintaining the same calm, level expression he's worn throughout the entire exchange. The silence extends, 5 seconds, 10, 15, 20. Long enough for every person in the room to look. Long enough for the reading to happen, for Thessari eyes to trace the layered patterns, assess the density of accumulated damage, evaluate the age distribution of different wound sets, and draw the conclusions that the scars themselves communicate without any words being spoken. Long enough for the room to understand that the man sitting at the peripheral table, the human attaché assigned to the marginal position, the representative of a species that the briefing had just dismissed as fragile and untested, is carrying on his body a record of sustained military experience that would command respect from any Thessari warrior in this room. Commander Thessara is the first to break the silence, but she doesn't resume her assessment, doesn't complete the sentence that Rylan interrupted, doesn't return to the operational planning that the briefing was supposed to address. Instead, she looks at Rylan with an expression that has shifted fundamentally from everything she was projecting 20 seconds ago. Her skin shows a color that Rylan has learned, over 2 years of careful observation, carries very specific meaning in Thessari military culture. Respect, not the diplomatic courtesy that Thessari extend to human personnel as a matter of alliance protocol. Not the polite acknowledgement that superiors offer inferiors when interactions require civility. The genuine, earned respect that Thessari warriors reserve for those who have demonstrated capability through sustained experience. The kind of respect that cannot be manufactured through words or documentation or any method other than showing the record itself. How long? Thessara asks. Her voice has changed completely, the smooth, practiced condescension replaced by something direct and unadorned. The question carries no preamble, no diplomatic framing, no hedging. It's the kind of question one warrior asks another when they've seen something on the other person's body that demands acknowledgement. Rylan considers the question for a moment, not because the answer is complicated, but because he's choosing exactly how much to say. Then he responds with the same level, unhurried tone he's used throughout. 32 years of active service, he says. 6 conflicts, 14 months of sustained combat operations during the longest engagement. He rolls his sleeve back down, covering the scars with the same practiced ease with which he revealed them. The motion is unhurried and deliberate, not hiding what's beneath the fabric, simply returning to the normal state of having it covered. The scars remain where they've always been. They don't need to be displayed to exist. I don't need to defend human capability, Rylan says, his voice carrying the same calm authority it's carried throughout. The record speaks for itself, but when someone says humans are untested, I want to make sure the word is being used accurately before we build operational plans around assumptions that might not hold. The briefing resumes approximately 3 minutes after Rylan rolls his sleeve back down. But the atmosphere in the room has shifted in ways that go beyond the surface level of conversation, resuming after interruption. Commander Thessara transitions directly into operational planning, without returning to her assessment of human limitations. The transition is smooth enough that someone observing casually might interpret it as the briefing simply moving to its next scheduled phase. But Rylan notices the differences, subtle shifts in how the discussion proceeds that indicate the room's understanding of human capability has been recalibrated. Human units are assigned patrol positions that reflect genuine capability assessment rather than reflexive assumptions about limitation. Questions directed to the human delegation during planning discussions carry the weight of genuine inquiry rather than perfunctory consultation. When a tactical scenario is presented that requires close-quarters engagement capability, the human specialist is included in the discussion without anyone suggesting that human forces should be assigned to secondary positions by default. None of these changes are dramatic. None are explicitly connected to what happened when Rylan rolled back his sleeve. But they're real, and they're consistent, and they represent a fundamental shift in how the Thessari officers in this room are approaching the question of what human forces can be expected to do. After the briefing concludes, Captain Vethros, Rylan's primary Thessari counterpart and cultural guide, finds him near the refreshment area where personnel typically gather for informal conversation after formal sessions end. That was effective, Vethros observes, his skin showing contemplative blue mixed with what looks like genuine analytical interest. More effective than any verbal argument you could have constructed. It wasn't meant to be an argument, Rylan replies, accepting a cup of something warm from the refreshment dispenser. Thessara made a claim. The claim was inaccurate. I corrected it using the most direct evidence available. You corrected it without speaking a single word of correction, Vethros points out. You showed evidence and let it communicate on its own. In Thessari culture, that distinction carries significant weight. In human culture too, Rylan says, particularly when the person making the inaccurate claim has already decided that verbal arguments from humans aren't worth taking seriously. Words can be dismissed. Physical evidence is harder to ignore. Vethros nods, his skin shifting through analytical colors as he processes what happened. Commander Thessara has spent her career operating under assumptions about human military capability that are based on comparing human experience to Thessari standards, without considering that those standards might not be the only valid measure of capability. What you showed her today, the density of scarring, the age distribution, the wound patterns, those communicate experience in ways that Thessari military culture specifically values and recognizes as meaningful. And that recognition can't be undone once it happens, Rylan observes. Exactly, Vethros confirms. In Thessari culture, we have a concept called kel'mara, roughly translated as the record that cannot be argued with. It refers to physical evidence of experience that speaks for itself without requiring interpretation, defense, or verbal support. What you displayed in that briefing room was kel'mara. Thessara saw it. She recognized it. She can't unsee it or unrecognize it. The scars have been there for 30 years, Rylan says. They haven't changed. The only thing that changed today was whether anyone bothered to look at them before deciding what humans are capable of. And now someone has looked, Vethros says. And what she saw contradicted assumptions she's carried for decades. That's difficult to reconcile with existing beliefs, but it's impossible to deny once the evidence has been directly observed. Rylan drinks from his cup, considering the conversation. I want to be clear about something, Captain. I didn't show those scars to embarrass Thessara or to score a point in a briefing. I showed them because her assessment was wrong, and the most efficient way to demonstrate that it was wrong was to show the evidence that contradicted it. The method matters less than the result, Vethros observes. The result is that 30 officers in that room are now operating with a more accurate understanding of human military capability. That will affect operational planning, assignment decisions, and how human forces are integrated into joint operations for months, possibly years. Good, Rylan says simply. 2 days later, a formal request arrives from Commander Thessara for a private meeting. Rylan accepts without hesitation. In 2 years of liaison work, he's never been approached directly by a Thessari commander of her rank for informal conversation, and the request itself communicates something significant about how she's processing what happened in the briefing room. They meet in one of the vessel's smaller conference rooms. Thessara enters without ceremony, her skin showing colors that suggest careful thought has preceded this conversation. She sits across from Rylan and is quiet for several seconds before speaking. "I want to acknowledge something," she says. Her voice carries the direct, unadorned quality of someone who has decided to skip diplomatic framing entirely. "What I said in the briefing about humans being untested, that assessment was based on assumptions I hadn't examined carefully enough. What you showed me corrected those assumptions in a way that I couldn't dismiss or argue with." "Appreciated," Rylan says. "The scars," Thessara continues, and there's something in her voice that suggests she's been thinking about this specific element since the briefing. "I've been reading them since that evening. 32 years of service. 6 conflicts. The wound distribution suggests close-quarters combat, explosive damage, sustained operations under extreme conditions. Some of those wounds, the oldest ones, suggest conflicts that were fought decades ago, before the alliance with the Thessari Empire existed." She meets his eyes directly. "Humans were fighting wars long before they met us. Enduring combat, sustaining casualties, developing the kind of experience that produces genuine military capability. I dismissed that history without examining it, because it was easier to measure human capability against Thessari standards, and find it lacking than to consider that humans might have their own depth of experience that simply looks different from ours. Most people make that mistake," Rylan says, "not out of malice, out of assumption. It's easier to measure everything against the standard you already know than to consider that other standards might be equally valid. Your scars taught me otherwise," Thessara says. "Not through argument, not through documentation or statistics or verbal defense. Through simple, undeniable physical evidence that communicated decades of experience in a single moment." She pauses. "In Thessari culture, we respect kel'mara, the record that cannot be argued with. What you showed me was exactly that. And I find myself respecting not just the record itself, but the restraint with which you displayed it. You didn't boast, didn't explain, didn't construct a narrative around the wounds. You simply showed them and let them speak. They don't need me to speak for them," Rylan says. "They've been speaking for 32 years. Most people just haven't been listening." The conversation with Commander Thessara becomes the foundation for a shift in how joint operations between Thessari and human forces are planned and executed aboard the Sovereign's Reach. The shift isn't immediate or dramatic. Institutional assumptions don't reverse overnight, and the cultural dynamics that produce Thessara's original assessment run deep enough that they can't be corrected through a single moment, however significant. But the shift is real, and it's measurable in ways that matter operationally. Human units begin receiving assignment recommendations that reflect genuine capability assessment rather than reflexive assumptions about limitation. Planning sessions include human input from the beginning rather than incorporating it as afterthought. When tactical scenarios require capability that human forces possess, those forces are considered without the automatic assumption that Thessari units should handle anything beyond basic escort duties. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of Rylan's junior attachés, notices the changes before Rylan explicitly points them out to her. She raises the observation during one of their regular working sessions with the kind of careful analysis that suggests she's been watching the dynamic shift for days before deciding to mention it. "Something changed after that briefing," Chen says. "The way Thessari commanders talk about human units in planning discussions. It's subtle. They're not suddenly treating us as equals or anything that dramatic, but the assumptions have shifted. They're actually evaluating our capability, now instead of starting from a predetermined conclusion. That's what happens when evidence contradicts assumptions," Rylan replies. "The assumptions don't disappear overnight, but they stop being the default starting point for every assessment." "The scars," Chen says, and there's something in her voice that suggests she's been thinking about this element specifically. "You used your own injuries, real wounds from real conflicts, as evidence in a briefing. Doesn't that feel, I don't know, uncomfortable, using something that painful as a rhetorical tool?" Rylan considers the question carefully before answering. "The scars aren't a rhetorical tool," he says. "They're a record. They exist on my body whether I show them or not, whether anyone looks at them or not. They don't change based on context or audience or purpose." He rolls his sleeve up slightly, not enough to show the scars fully, just enough to indicate their presence beneath the fabric. Thessara said humans are untested. That statement was factually wrong. The most direct way to demonstrate that it was wrong was to show the evidence that contradicted it. The evidence happened to be written on my body rather than stored in a database. That doesn't make it less valid. It makes it harder to dismiss. Chen nods slowly. And you didn't explain any of it, didn't tell the story behind the wounds or put them in context, you just showed them. Because the moment I start explaining, I'm constructing a narrative, Rylan says, and narratives can be challenged, questioned, disputed. The scars themselves can't be, they're simply there. They communicate what they communicate without requiring my interpretation or defense. Adding explanation would actually weaken what they say, not strengthen it. He rolls his sleeve back down. In Thessari culture, showing experience without boasting about it carries more weight than describing it in detail. The restraint communicates something about the person who carries the record, that they don't need external validation for what they've endured. The experience stands on its own. The scars speak for themselves. Kel'mara, Chen says, having heard the concept explained during one of Vethros's cultural briefings. Kel'mara, Rylan confirms. Months later, when the operational dynamics between Thessari and human forces aboard the Seventh Fleet have settled into patterns that reflect genuine mutual assessment rather than one-sided assumption, Rylan finds himself in another joint briefing where Commander Thessara is presenting operational plans. The briefing is different from the one where everything shifted. Thessara's presentation treats human forces as full operational participants, assigning them roles based on demonstrated capability, incorporating human tactical input into planning discussions, building joint strategies that leverage the specific strengths each species brings rather than defaulting to Thessari-dominant operational models. The change isn't attributed to the scarring incident in any official documentation. It's simply how things are now, how Thessari commanders in this fleet approach the question of human capability. The assumption has shifted from humans are untested to humans have their own record of experience that deserves assessment on its own terms. After the briefing, Thessara catches Rylan's eye across the room. Her skin shows warm gold, not the confident gold of someone asserting superiority, but the deeper shade that indicates genuine respect earned through demonstrated experience rather than claimed through words. She nods once, a gesture that carries weight precisely because it says nothing that needs to be said. Rylan nods back. The conversation is complete without either of them speaking, because some records don't need words to communicate what they mean. An alien woman had scoffed at humans, had dismissed them as fragile, inexperienced, untested, words that drew nods and entertained skin colors from a room full of warriors who shared those assumptions without questioning them. A man had rolled back his sleeve, and the words had been cut short, not by argument, not by rebuttal, not by any of the verbal or documentary methods that humans typically use to defend their capabilities when those capabilities are dismissed. By truth, written on skin by 32 years of experience that didn't care about species or assumption or cultural hierarchy. Old enough to have healed into permanent record. Dense enough to communicate decades of conflict endured in a single glance. Silent enough that no boasting followed, no explanation was offered, no narrative was constructed. He simply showed the record, and the room understood. Because experience doesn't need defending when it's written on the body in ways that anyone willing to look can read. And truth, once seen, ends arguments more cleanly than any rebuttal ever could. kel'mara, the record that cannot be argued with. Rylan had carried it for 32 years, had lived with it every day, the physical chronicle of everything he'd endured, everything he'd survived, everything that had been demanded of him by conflicts that offered no choice about when or how to fight. The scars were not a weapon, were not a rhetorical device or a cultural manipulation or a dramatic gesture designed to silence a room full of assumptions. They were simply what they had always been, a record, written on